Hey, Sri, when we think of compliance monitoring and the way that it's been traditionally approached, we're usually thinking about lexicons and keyword spotting. But in what way is AI really changing the game for how regulated industries like financial services are approaching compliance monitoring?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, Jeremy, thanks for inviting me to this conversation. So I'm really excited and look forward for the conversation because, compliance, AI, and customer interaction were like three worlds that used to be quite separate, but they are kind of colliding right now, right? And if you talk about the lexicons and keywords, right? So this goes back to like the 2010s when I kind of started my career as a contact center consultant. And back then, keyword spotting, matching by keywords were like big. But back in the day, like, for example, in trading environments, right? You will look for words like guarantee or front run, but things evolve and humans generally don't speak in neat compliance dictionaries anymore. So, they kind of use slangs or keywords or even emojis in the chat, right? So that's what traditional keyword systems fail, right? And they kind of is
Mm,
false positive or miss the real risk. So maybe I can expand on it, right? Like, how AI,
yeah,
kind of enhances compliance beyond these keywords. So,
yeah.
AI shifts the focus from keywords to context. So it understands who is speaking particular conversation, what is the role and who's the counterparty or the other party in that conversation, and also understand the intent, not just the words, right? So let's take an
Mm,
example, right? So maybe a trader might be having a funny banter with his colleague, right? And that is very different from an advisor misleading a client to buy something, right? So, it's all about the context. Then also what you could do with the AI is basically assign certain personas for monitoring. So rather than using a blanket keyword, right? Like maybe, I want to cancel, right? You could profile a certain type of users, maybe an equity trading desk analyst, or maybe a customer service representative, right? So you're kind of evaluating the risk related to the activity, right? And another one is efficiency gain. So compliance team managers could basically, analyze the calls that the AI, presents to it rather than running behind the noise of keywords. And then there is a regulatory framework as well, right? So especially regulators in Australia, the APRA and the ASIC, they don't kind of dictate to firms that, you have to use this particular model or this algorithm. But there is a high expectation on the auditability, the data quality and risk management. So, AI makes compliance teams look forward facing or being
mm.
reactive, right? So you're mainly becoming more proactive right now. So, basically I would summarize in this way, like, compliance, is evolving from the list of words or bag of words, as you call in the machine learning world, and starts being about the behaviors in context, right? And that's a massive shift from what we have seen, in the last 2 to 3 years.
Wow, it's so fascinating and it's growing so quickly in its
Yeah.
capability. It really reminds me of you've told me in the past, and I don't think I'm ever going to forget this
Yeah.
stat, that on average, only about 3% of customer service calls are even reviewed by humans. In what ways is AI opening up the analysis capability of calls for
Yeah, I
compliance?
mean, that's an astounding, stat, right? Because even I was surprised when I saw that, because we know that in it's obviously it is less than 100% is call coverage, right? So with the current organization that I work for, we kind of did a research and we found that basically only 3% of the customer calls are being ever reviewed, right? So let's put into perspective, like if you have like 1,000 calls, 3% of that is like 30%, 30 calls. That's way
Yeah.
less, right? So I use a different type of analogy. Let's say you go to a doctor and you have your blood result report with you. And let's say the doctor analyzes only 3% of that report, right? It doesn't help, right? So that's where AI
Mhm.
kind of steps in. So maybe I can expand on that. So you can use AI at scale. So using AI, you could analyze 100% of all your interactions. So that can be your calls, your emails, your video meetings, any chats as well, right? And that's consistent, right? So that's a keyword that I would like to use. Consistently, it can go and do this. So
Mm,
in terms
mm,
of human engagement, so what we would do is like, you're kind of empowering the human to, focus on the critical things. So what in this case would do basically the AI helps is like it would surface these patterns or risk, and then maybe only 5% of those calls are really required for human intervention, right? Rather than looking at random samples. So that's where, you kind of empower your agents or your contact center or your compliance managers. And then there is a fairness aspect as well. So, in the traditional contact center world, a contact center manager would kind of sample maybe like 2 or 3 calls out of 100 calls made by an agent. And it is a luck, right? You kind of lean on the luck factor for that particular agent, right? But with AI, it ranks all the calls, 100% of your calls. And this kind of improves your morale and your coaching as well. And another one is, there are like very low hanging fruits or practical use cases that you can implement even today, like an entry point. So like automatic call summaries, dispute resolution, your customer churn and things like that from the behavior of your agents and also your customer calls as well. And human in the loop is really important because you don't want an AI solution to make a judgment call, right? So as I've said earlier, the AI would surface those patterns and risk, signals, and it would present to a human, and the human would be able to judge on those data provided, right? So, and that's what even the regulators need. So you want an explainable AI with human oversight or intervention. So maybe to summarize, I would say is like when you can listen your calls at a scale, right? The conversation kind of shifts from, compliance being a cost center to compliance being a source of insight or landmine of, insight, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Fascinating. And what a transformation that can
Yeah.
deliver. And that really takes us to the next point. There's a lot of people that see voice and video recording more as a compliance
Yeah.
checkbox. What I think is so interesting about how you are positioning this and the way that you're talking to your partners and potential partners is how to bring AI knowledge from license management through to business intelligence. How does that become a strategic advantage for your
Yeah,
partners?
so even now, right? Like it's a great question, and it's it's always a contesting one as well. So even now, like many organizations see like recording or call, anyway activity, basically your call monitoring things like as a recording tick box, or maybe because the regulators have asked them to, record the calls. But if you treat
Yeah.
these recordings as data assets, you really unlock, the massive value that they have. So what I would like to frame is basically compliance is intelligence. So, it can reveal a lot of data that you kind of miss out, right? Like, why customers churn out, why complaints rise within your organization, and how well the teams kind of sales team kind of stick to the scripts when making or receiving calls, right? So basically there are a couple of business outcomes that you can get out of it. Like, you can identify certain behavior with high customer satisfaction. If you're an FSI organization, you can basically spot early signs of financial distress by monitoring these calls. And if you're a large contact center, you can detect signs of training on a large scale as well, right? Because you're reviewing 100% of those calls. And another one is if you see the Australian regulators, especially APRA, so they have come out with 2 prudential standards. So it's CPS 230 and CPS 234, which were released last year, like 2024. And what they basically kind of ask is basically, boards need to show that they're learning from the operational data, right? So, anything that relates to customer interaction is operational data because that's your kind of bread and butter, dealing with your customers. And you can use the data for your learning purpose as well. And this is not just in, a tick box. You could leverage those recordings to mainly use as a proactive mechanism as well. And for partners, this is huge because you kind of differentiate, from, just selling licenses, but you're kind of showing value to your customers and showing them that, okay, you have untapped data lying in your business, which you can use to increase your revenue or maybe increase your customer satisfaction as well. So you have to move the conversation from, have you done your call recording? Maybe you have to change it to what are we learning from those, recorded data? Yeah.
I think that's so profound. The ability to move from we're offering you cheap archival storage to business intelligence enablement.
Exactly. That's yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah. Hey, speaking of which, something that I think is so cool about your background, you've got extensive background as a solutions architect, having worked closely with risk and compliance teams. What do you really see as the biggest barriers for teams in the way that they're approaching AI, and what might be holding them back in stepping into it more confidently?
Yeah, it's a great question again, right? Because AI, I would say is even it's like almost like 3 to 4 years old now, but it is still relatively new or mainstream to the
Yeah.
market. So one of the hardest, the hurdle path is basically translating between the compliance and the technology leaders, because they often talk past each other, right? So because the desire of outcome is very different. So some of the barriers that we kind of see is basically the fear of black box AI. So they don't understand what is beneath the AI layer, and also what kind of
Right.
data is being fed to that model. And also the misaligned incentives of which I've mentioned to you, because IT wants to deploy it very fast, a solution, and compliance needs that certainty on whether this would work. So what I've seen in the market, especially is, your data, like especially with FSIs, they are very particular about the data sovereignty and where the data gets shipped, right? So you must always be careful on choosing your vendors. You have to do your due diligence on which model they're using, whether the data is being shipped to a third-party sub-processor, because there are many vendors or many solutions out there who kind of do those cutting of cost, and where they kind of outsource the data to a third-party AI, solution provider. And usually when it is cheap, your data is being used to train other models out there. So you have to be very careful on choosing the right provider and the right model, and also the sub-processor that the solution provider uses. And in terms of aligning to different frameworks, so there are like two frameworks that I particularly call out when I talk to compliance officers and technology leaders. So the first one is NIST AI Risk Management Framework and the ISO AI Management System Standard, right? So there are particularly, I would say, recent developments, but many of the larger enterprises kind of, use them as a framework. And that framework will kind of lead, help you with the AI adoption. And also, when you start with an AI project, always start small. Maybe pick the low, the quick wins, but also tie a pilot talk with a outcome, right? Because many of those AI projects start without a success criteria. Maybe, it's a flashy thing. We want to try this, but it doesn't work out, right? So that's the usual case. So always have a success criteria in mind, right? And that builds confidence as well. And also have the AI model explain to you on how it has come to that particular conclusion or outcome. So that's another thing. And yeah, so, and basically maybe to summarize, I would say that, if AI is governed like any other control that's there in the enterprise, then the adoption is pretty simple.
Yeah. It's been in the news a lot lately that FSIs are already investing pretty heavily into AI in Australia. You're working with MSPs and other partners day in and day out. In your view, what separates those who are capturing this opportunity versus those who might be getting left behind?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, right? Because the AI investment in the FSI market in Australia is like growing rapidly, or is kind of accelerating. But unfortunately, not every partner will be able to capture the growth. You
Mm,
know, because what I would say is like the differentiation between those MSPs and ISVs is, what kind of services that you kind of provide in that layer, right? So maybe from a compliance perspective, what I could say is, if you can help those organizations that you're working with, especially the tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 banks, you could help them with the compliance automation, like internal, dispute resolution, which is aligned to the RG 271 framework, quality assessment, operational resilience reporting, which I've mentioned earlier, which is basically the provincial safety of 230, and the customer intelligence that you get from the contact center or the customer service center, right? So partners who will be able to who will be able to combine compliance, fluency with AI skills. And they also have the framework around the ISO and the NIST, which I mentioned, and they are able to deliver outcomes, in 1 to 2 months rather than 12 months. Are the partners who will succeed, right? Who basically have that finesse skill around delivering outcomes in consistently as well. Because even Gartner mentions that there are many agentic AI projects that's out there, and when they're not tied to an outcome, as I mentioned, they kind of fail, right? And partners should kind of avoid the hype and focus on customer value. That's what I would say.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a great answer. Compliance fluency with AI skills is an awesome
Yeah.
reference. I'm going to need to remember that one.